in mind, how do you read things like the allocation of the chairs of certain committees to supporters of former President Zuma? Do you think this proves that Ramaphosa is still, not 100% in control and relatively weak?
I think on the one hand, if one simply look at the names, one can say, it's really a mix of people that's been fingered in the State Capture Commission. There's, former members of, provincial executives, former mayors, even, 2 or 3 former executive members of Jacob Zuma's cabinet. And one has to question the timing. This is the first time in the history of this parliament, and this is the 6th parliament, that the commission chairpersons were announced on the eve of the State of the Nation. So one can clearly see in terms of the timing, and it was postponed several times, that there was a lot of horse trading happening, and it was factional horse trading that was happening. And in fact, the ANC Secretary General Magashule, he was at the media briefing announcing those names. So I think, that on the surface, one has to raise the issue of timing, and that there must have been some really back and fro horse trading happening. So I think the first person that stands up is Faith Mthambi. Now, she's the Cooperative Governance Committee chairperson. She will have to account to her political boss, so to say, will be Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. We know that she, of course, challenged Cyril Ramaphosa, but she's now, completely one of the basically the part of the inner circle of Cyril Ramaphosa, and one of those people that are really brought in. She got a senior position. She spent the past few months within the presidency. So I do think that the local government ministry, really is the engine room of South Africa in terms of its governance. If we look at the state of municipalities, and also just the service delivery protests we've had, if the ANC doesn't deal with this, if Alex, just before the election, the Alex shutdown was anything to show us that, local government is in dire need. She then has 2 very powerful deputies in the form of Park Stow, who was the former Johannesburg mayor, but he was also the chairperson of the South African Local Government Association. So he has intimate knowledge of what needs to happen in terms of changing the dynamics within local government. And then Obed Papela, who was a former deputy minister, so he's a safe pair of hands. So it means Faith Mthambi will have to read documents. She won't have anyone, one of her advisors, to read her documents. She will actually, as a chair, have to engage with all the political parties. She will have to listen, and that she will have to account and provide provide some assistance and provide some policy direction for the minister. Now, the reality is that Ms. Mthambi, the Gupta leaks showed how she had leaked cabinet information to the Guptas. Also, we cannot miss the fact that she's been one of the few ministers who's been in regular attendance at Jacob Zuma's trial in Pietermaritzburg. But, she is now in charge of that. Then our second most interesting character is, of course, Mozabenzi Zwane. He was also, a very close ally of Magashule. We saw his dodgy dealings with the Gupta link to get acquisition of the Optimum coal mine. We saw during his tenure as Free State Agriculture MEC, he was the person who officially invited and ensured the landing of that 23 Gupta wedding plane at Waterkloof Air Base and the establishment of the Vrede Dairy Farm. So he cannot, cannot be ignored. But he's the Transport Chairperson Committee. The Minister of Transport is Fikile Mbalula, who ran the ANC's election campaign, who, calls himself Mr. Fix-It and all sort of other names. He will really not be the easiest person for Mozabenzi Zwane to work with. if Mr. Zwane decides to, have any of his factional or seem to be undermining Fikile Mbalula, I think Fikile is certainly not going to allow anyone to undermine his passion and commitment and wanting to see some serious changes within the transport sector. Ironically, Cyril Ramaphosa during his election campaign, he was stuck in a train for almost 2 hours. So he has spoken extensively on the need for the railway system to really work, to be able to take people to work. So I don't think Mosebenzi Zwane is going to be allowed to even have time for factional politics, because Fikile Mbalula is going to keep him way too busy, to even allow for any other, sort of factional dynamics. But I think another interesting person is Bongani Bongo. He was the minister very briefly of state security. He's now the chairperson of Home Affairs. And, of course, Home Affairs, they have a new minister in the form of the former health minister, Aaron Motsoaledi, who is a doer, the passion, just seeing him yesterday, he was telling us about his plans for Home Affairs. So I do think if it was any other minister, one would say, well, he would be able to get away with it. But I don't think, Aaron Motsoaledi as Home Affairs Minister is going to allow Bongani Bongo to do anything. So my reading of it is that, you bring those that were seen as the sort of Jacob Zuma, supporters within the National Executive Committee. Instead of keeping them idle, you keep them busy, because these committee work is actually, it's quite hard work. It's very bureaucratic, No one says thank you for the work that you do as a committee chairperson. And it actually just keeps you so busy. So I think the strategy from the Ramaphosa side is bring those people within, make them work, make them be part of, the sort of policy direction. And they might be so busy that they don't have time for all the factional dynamics, because they actually have to be in Cape Town for the parliamentary session. So they cannot be at home base. So you actually keep them busy here. 2, they have very strong ministers that they have to account to. And I don't think those ministers are going to allow for any factional dynamics. And then lastly, there's some very dynamic members of parliament. I don't think the new guard of EFF MPs are just going to allow Mr. Zwane, Mr. Bonga, or Ms. Mtambi to get away with things. We have some very young members of parliament, very dynamic, that are actually going to read documents. And I think, quite frankly, will keep those committee chairpersons on their toes, and will force them to actually account and do the work that they are supposed to do.
So you think, Cyril Ramaphosa either isn't too bothered or is actually quite happy that the kind of Ace Magashule, Jacob Zuma faction has got the chair of these committees, because he thinks that, looks like he's sharing out the kind of power within Parliament, and they're going to be so busy, they're not going to be able to, and they certainly aren't going to be in a position to upend government policy. Because, the press greeted those announcements. Ace Magashule's announcement that his allies had won all these committee chairs. And they were saying, Ramaphosa looks really weak. This is another victory for the Zuma faction. Do you think all that is actually just a misread?
I think so. I would think that Ramaphosa, he has a plan. The fact that these are the particular portfolio, committees, the particular ministers that they also have to account to. I don't think it's just by accident that they were given those portfolios, because it means they will actually have to work. It actually means that you bring in all these different factions, say, for instance, including like Supra Maupelo, who was the Northwest Premier, who was one of the architects of, the kind of Jacob Zuma power base, with Ace Magashule. He's now in Cape Town. Being a committee chairperson is really not glamorous at all. It's actually quite hard work. It's, it's a thankless job. And I think you bring, those enemies, those that were plotting against you, you bring them back in the fold. And, you get them to work, and eventually, you might see, that these, they just don't have much time for those kind of factional battles. And I think that is part of the Cyril strategy, bring them in, keep them busy, build consensus, and, eventually, they'll come to your side. But I mean, the opposition parties, they were really quite outraged in their response to those committee chairperson, seeing it as a disregard for people. But I do think that, Cyril Ramaphosa has shown us in the past that, there's always a plan. There's a reason why he's doing it. And I think this was part of the compromise, that you bring those people in, you keep them busy, and that they are still there, in terms of, they are part of the ANC, and that they are not kicked to the curb, and that, they are part of building Cyril Ramaphosa's new dawn.
There is a bit of a worrying one, though. The former Deputy Finance Minister, Sifiso Buthelezi, he has been accused by the opposition parties of corruption when he was chairman of the commuter rail service. I know he denies any wrongdoing. I think one of the opposition parties has laid criminal charges against him. I guess that could get quite nasty. And he's now chair of the Budget Appropriations Committee, which puts him presumably in quite a strong position to intervene and so on.
Yes, and also having a say on the public spending, at a time when the public purse we know is quite strange. So, of course, we know Buthelezi was a very close Zuma ally, including, and he defended the board chairperson, Dudu Mnyeni. But what's quite interesting of that committee, that committee is really hard work. And interestingly enough, Paul Mashatile was the chairperson of that committee. And at the time, people really just saw it as such a demotion for Paul Mashatile. Because it's, it's one of those boring committees that no one actually goes to. It's highly technical. You literally have the parliamentary budget unit sitting in your committees all the time, because they literally have to just feed you information around the specifics. It is a very, very technical committee. It's not glamorous at all, and it's actually quite a lot of work. So it's going to be interesting to see how Mr. Buthelezi, runs that committee. But I think that we of course have still not heard the end of Mr. Buthelezi's involvement, especially he was also head of the Public Investment Corporation, and for some time during his tenure as Deputy Finance Minister. So I don't think we've heard yet, and I suspect things will still come out around the PIC. So the other issue that I think is still something to watch out for, a lot of these people have been, they've been mentioned at the State Capture Commission. We don't know what other things might come out, especially say around the SABC and the, investigative unit that's still investigating there. We don't know what's going to come out still from the Vrede Dairy, incident of, say, for instance, Mr. Zwane. We don't know PIC, Buthelezi. So, the reality is that we don't know if any of these people might still be implicated in some serious wrongdoing, and that the National Prosecuting Authority might be acting on some of those allegations, and who knows what might happen to them in the next year or so.
Crystal, if you step back in the Parliament and look at, the controversy over these committee chairs and so on, and then the reception that Ramaphosa got for his State of the Nation address yesterday, how do you assess the balance of power within, say, first of all, the ANC caucus? Is it really pretty finely balanced, almost 50-50 between support for Ramaphosa's agenda, reform agenda, et cetera, and people like Tito Mboweni and Ibrahim Patel? Or is it almost, does it seem like Zuma and Magashule have actually got the majority in Parliament?
Yes, I think my assessment, watching everything last night was that it's still sort of 50-50, because even we asked, Ace Magashule about, the fact that, they've appointed these committee chairs. And he basically told us that none of them have been found guilty by a court of law. So who are we as the media to be judging any of those committee chairs? That's what he told us in a very firm way. And so my reading of that, because usually, firstly, when you have the State of the Nation and reaction, there's usually one spokesperson from the ANC, and that usually used to be, Gwedi Mantashe, who spoke in reaction to any State of the Nation.